Do you want to grow cheaper food? I had this question asked in our Facebook group called Garden Fundamentals. How can I utilize my garden to save money on groceries? My garden always costs me way more than the amount of food I can get from it. Now that's a very common question and a common problem. So in this program, I'm going to look at how easy it is to make money growing your own food. And then I'm going to give you a whole bunch of tips to reduce your costs. I think the first question we should ask is, can we grow food in our own garden and save money? My answer to that is no, you can't. I know a lot of you believe you can, but figure out how many hours you spend in the garden. Add to that all the costs you have, and then figure out whether you're actually saving money or you'd be better off getting a part-time job somewhere and make money that way and buy your groceries. I don't think most of us save much money in our vegetable gardens. There's a famous book called The $64 Tomato. It looks at someone who is new to gardening and puts in a new garden to grow tomatoes, and at the end of the year he spent $64 for every tomato he grew. Now that might sound outrageous, but I know some new gardeners do that. Now, there are a lot of good reasons to grow your own food that have nothing to do with cost. There's nothing as fresh as the food you can go out and get from your own backyard. A lot of you find that the flavor of your own grown food is better. Now, you may be a little biased there, but it certainly is fresh. Gardening is a great exercise. It's also a process where you have to give it some thought and you have to learn things. So from a mental perspective and a self-development perspective, it's a really nice hobby. And even though gardening may cost you a bit of money, you're going to have some kind of hobbies and they all cost money. In fact, most of them cost more than gardening. And on top of that, you get great food to eat. So I think everyone should garden. But if you're doing it to save money, you're going to be disappointed, especially in those first few years where you're getting your garden established and you're buying things for the first time. If you don't have a shovel, you got to go out and buy a shovel. That's a big expense compared to that tomato you're going to grow. But that's the kind of expense you won't have for the next 20 years if you buy a good shovel and take care of it. All right, so how do you save money growing your own food? My first suggestion is a bit biased, but I would get on my YouTube channel, Garden Fundamentals, and watch all of my videos about growing vegetables. There's a whole course there. It's a 13-part video. For those who know me, you know that I spend as little money as possible for growing anything in the garden. I don't believe in most of the gadgets and bottles of stuff people sell. It's just not needed. All right, let's look at some ways you can reduce your cost. Number one is to start out the right way. You're probably not going to like this first suggestion, but I'm not a big fan of raised beds, the ones with walls around them. Where you take some wood or bricks and you build a nice rectangular shape and fill it full of expensive soil, and now you have a raised bed to grow in. I see so many people saying, it's so great, it's necessary, so I don't have to bend down. Well, I have news for you. I've always grown right on the ground, and I do very little bending. I might bend over to plop some seeds in the ground or to harvest a carrot, but the rest of the year, I'm using tools for that, standing up. When I go to harvest tomatoes, the tomatoes are right around here. I don't have to bend over to get tomatoes. Now, I've used raised beds for over 40 years. In fact, I was probably one of the first gardeners to ever use raised beds. But back then, we didn't make walls. What we did was we lined out our garden beds, figured out where the pathways were going to go. Then we dug about 6 inches of soil in the pathway and dumped it on top of the bed, added a bit of manure, dug it all up, and we had our raised beds. The bed itself was about 6 inches above the pathway, so it was raised. There were no walls, and there was almost no cost except for the manure. For some reason, today's new gardeners think that the only way to grow good food is in raised beds, and that's completely wrong. It may be a little more convenient, but you can grow food just as well on the ground as you can in raised beds. Another suggestion I have is to start small. You're new to gardening, you're all excited. You open that seed catalog and you see like 100 different vegetables and you start picking them all. Then the package comes in and it's this big and you got so many seeds you don't know what to do with. You're completely overwhelmed. Don't do that. Pick 4 or 5 vegetables that you want to grow. Focus on those for the first couple years. Learn to do a good job with those. That'll keep your costs down. You won't have to learn as much material to grow 4 or 5 as opposed to 20 vegetables. And if you pick the right ones, which I'm going to help you do, you're going to be successful. Now, as you gain more experience, add some others to the list. But start small. Don't turn your whole backyard into a garden. Start with 1 or 2 beds and see if you like it. See if you like growing food. Learn about the process and then expand as you get more knowledgeable and you enjoy the hobby. So which vegetables should you start with? Well, a number of years ago, I put together a video of the 10 vegetables I recommend for new gardeners. And my selection criteria was based on this. 1, they're very productive. They produce a lot of food for a small amount of space. 2, they're ones that most people like to eat. Don't grow vegetables you really don't care for just because someone online said, hey, this is a good one to grow. I don't like kale particularly, so I've never grown it. I love tomatoes, and that's one of the ones on my list. The third criteria is how easy is it to grow. Some vegetables are much easier to grow than others. Now, almost anyone can grow garlic or a radish. Tomatoes are tougher. Cabbage and Brussels sprouts, they're even harder. So stick to the ones I recommend in my video, the 10 best vegetables for new gardeners. When I say start small, I also mean don't plant too much. You'd be amazed at how many zucchinis you get off of one plant. Don't put in 20 in the garden. You'll be overwhelmed and you won't know what to do with them. Start with a small row or 1 or 2 plants and see how it goes. Don't go out and buy a lot of fancy equipment. All you really need is a good shovel, a good rake, and a trowel. If you don't have one, you will need a hose because you do have to water vegetable gardens. But that's pretty much it as far as equipment goes. And my recommendation is that you actually buy some good tools. Don't cheap out on your shovel. For years I bought cheap shovels and every year I'd break one. Either the handle broke or the blade broke because it wasn't thick enough. Now I'm a pretty strong guy and my soil is full of rock. That certainly was much harder on a shovel than in some gardens. But then I went out and bought some good steel shovels, and I've had the same one for 15 years now. In fact, I went out and bought 5 of them, and I still have the first one. The other 4s are just spares. Don't buy a lot of soil amendments and fertilizers. Boy, you go down to the nursery, or you open up Amazon and look there, and there's all kinds of things you can buy. Mycorrhizal fungi. It's great for the garden. You need it. Bloom booster fertilizer. Bone meal. Epsom salts. How about a moisture meter? Weed barrier. How do you keep down the weeds? The list is endless. And the bags of stuff you can buy, there's so many different options. You don't need 99% of that stuff. Everything I just mentioned, you don't need. In fact, some of them you shouldn't be buying. Will you need some fertilizer? Well, perhaps. Get yourself some urea. That's the nitrogen, and that's probably the only nutrient you have to add. A good compost goes a long way. Find a horse farm and get some manure. That's even cheaper. Forget all the other fancy things. Most of them either don't work or they're just simply not needed. Now, should you use seeds or transplants? When the original question about gardening at a low price was asked on Facebook, a lot of people wrote in and said, go with seeds. Stay away from the transplants, they're too expensive. Now that's partially true, but in some ways transplants can be less expensive. For instance, if I'm a new gardener and I decide, I'm going to go with seeds, I'll save some money there. I still have to buy the seeds. Then I bring them home and I have to start them. I don't have any pots for them, so I'll go out and buy some pots. And now I need some media to grow them in. I'll have to go out and buy that too. And then once they germinate, well, there's lights. I don't have enough light for them, so now I go out and buy some LED lights for them. Now the heating mat you see online is needed. That's a luxury item, forget that. But if you're going to grow from seeds, you do need some basic equipment and you need some good lights to grow these, or you're going to end up with very spindly little seedlings. Oh yeah, you also need some fertilizer for that. So you need to get them started on fertilizer. Or if you're a new gardener, go out in spring and splurge on some transplants. They're already growing. Someone's done that for you. You've saved the money up front, but paid a little bit more for the seedlings. And if you shop around, they're really not that expensive. I buy my starter plants and they're $2 or $3 a plant. And let's say tomatoes, I only need 4 to get the garden going. That's not very expensive. I'll spend more on LED lights than I will on the transplants. But if you want to learn how to grow from seeds, that's certainly the less expensive way to go. And in the long run, you'll save money, because those lights will last you for 10 years. And the pots, if you buy the right ones, the real plastic pots, they can be used over and over again, so they're good for at least 10 years. And even the soil could be reused, although we usually don't do that because you're going to take all of it and plant it out in the garden. Seedlings are certainly less expensive, but you also have to learn more. So if you're new to gardening, there's time involved in sitting down and learning how to grow things from seed. Thankfully, my YouTube channel is full of videos on starting things from seed, so you won't have any problems there. Now, there are 2 groups of vegetables. There's some that we start indoors, and that's what I've been talking about here. And then there's others we plant from seed directly in the ground. So now you don't need LED lights. Things like radishes, carrots, cucumbers, they can all be planted directly in the ground. And so that's really good for new gardeners as well. It simplifies the whole thing. For a couple dollars, I can buy enough pea seeds to feed a family of 10. Another suggestion I have is know your climate. Now that can save you money as well, because it's going to help you pick the right vegetables. There are some vegetables that just don't grow well in hot climate, and there's some that don't grow well in cold climate. So by knowing your climate, you're going to make a better choice about the vegetables that you do buy. For instance, I'm in a cold climate. I'm in zone 5. We have a very short growing season. So when I go and buy my seeds, I look for the varieties that have a short growing season. That way my produce is ready sooner and I have a longer harvest period. I don't grow things like watermelons. Watermelons take all summer to grow, and maybe they're ready before the frost hits. That's not the kind of crop I'm looking for. I want to grow something that is ready to harvest in August, so I can harvest it in August, September, and October. That way I get much more value out of my garden. The next step is to select the actual vegetables you're going to grow. As mentioned before, some are easier to grow and some produce higher yields. As a new gardener, focus on the ones that have high yield and are easy to grow. And of course, things you like to eat. Here's a list of some of the ones that I would recommend. Now, there are others that are quite good to grow in the garden, but they're a little more difficult to grow, and or they don't yield quite so much. Without the knowledge of how to grow them well, you probably will be disappointed with this list coming along here. Another thing you can do is go to the grocery store and just look at the prices. If you're going to grow something that is expensive to buy. For instance, fresh peas can be very expensive. Most of the greens are very expensive, things like lettuce. Now they're expensive in a grocery store because they're very difficult to ship and they spoil easily. But they're also one of the easiest things to grow in the garden. Now I stay away from things like potatoes and onions. In the fall I can go and buy a huge bag of potatoes for next to nothing. I can grow them and they grow fairly well and they produce fairly well, but at the end of the season when I have this big pile of potatoes, I really haven't saved much money here. Another option that many gardeners don't think about are perennial vegetables. These are things that you plant once and you harvest for the next 20, 30 years. Now the downside to these for a new gardener is that they usually take a couple years to get going. So you plant them in year 1 and you don't harvest in years 2 and 3 because they have to bulk up, they have to get bigger. And then in year 4 you start harvesting. And as a new gardener you don't want to wait around for that to happen. So plant some things from seed that you're going to harvest this year. At the same time, think about adding a perennial vegetable here and there. A couple that I really like are rhubarb and chives. Both of those plants actually grow in my ornamental bed. I think rhubarb plants are quite nice. Nice big leaves, very attractive plant. Chives flower really nicely. So they're sitting beside all my flowers. And so they're not using space up in my vegetable garden. Once they're planted, they take no work at all. Raspberries and strawberries also fall into this category. You won't get much the first year, but the second, third, and 10th year you'll be harvesting. And my all-time favorite, garlic. Now it's not a perennial. You go and buy sets, you plant them. At the end of the growing season, which is midsummer, you harvest the bulbs, you pull off the biggest cloves, and you replant them in the fall. I'm growing the same garlic I bought 20 years ago. Every year I grow enough for myself and a few extras for replanting. I never have to buy that crop. I essentially have free garlic every year, and garlic is one of the easiest things to grow. Here's a little trick nobody knows about. Why not eat your perennials? Now you can eat the flowers off a lot of perennials, but they don't really add much nutrition. They may add some flavor. But did you know that hostas can be eaten? Now you have to harvest them in early spring when the shoots are quite small, but they taste a lot like asparagus. And I have a blog post that tells you how to grow them, harvest them, and even has some recipe ideas for hosta. All right, so here are some advanced techniques that will help you save money in the garden. First one is saving seeds. Now you have to be a little careful how you do this. You can't save seed from just any plant. If you want to save seed, it's a good idea to use heirlooms. These are plants that come true year after year from the same seed. And so you can grow the plant, save a few seeds, and use those next year. Now you don't have to buy seeds again, so there's savings there. You do have to be a little careful with this. For instance, all the varieties of squash can cross-pollinate with some of the members of the squash family. And so if you grow those too close together, you'll get hybrids, and the hybrids may not be as good as the plant you started with. Another problem with heirlooms is that the plants may not be as resistant to disease. But don't let that scare you away from heirlooms. Give them a try. Now, a lot of people suggest canning and preserving the food. So they recommend you grow lots of food and then preserve it all. Now, that may save you some money, but again, you have the problem that you have to go out and buy things to do the preserving. If you don't have a lot of jars and lids and so on, you have to go and buy those. If you don't have a pressure cooker, you have to go and buy those. So there is an upfront cost if you're not canning already. The other cost is time. And I don't think a lot of people who do canning add in their time not only to do the canning, but also to learn how to do this. Now, if that's a hobby that you'd like to get into, that's great. Go ahead. But I think if you're doing that to save money, I have a better suggestion. In my garden, what I do is I grow things for fresh eating. I grow them and then I harvest them and bring them in and eat them right away. In fact, we eat as much as possible raw. I find that really special in the garden, and that's something I can't buy at the grocery stores, really fresh produce. If I were canning, I wouldn't grow a whole pile of tomatoes and make sauce out of it. I'd wait until end of summer, go to the market, and I can buy a whole bushel of tomatoes for next to nothing, and I'll can those. So in my garden, I want to focus on the things I can't buy at a good price. But there's certainly nothing wrong with you growing food and canning it. Collect fall leaves. We haven't talked much about soil, but one of your jobs as a gardener is to keep building up that soil. And what that means is you have to add some organic matter. And fall leaves are perfect for that. You can get them for free around the neighborhood, bring them into your garden, mulch with them, chop them up, bury them once they're composted, and you build your soil year after year and it gets better and better. Grass clippings are the same way. People throw those things in the garbage. Can you imagine? That's free stuff that has huge value for building soil. I'm a big believer in mulch, and my vegetable garden gets mulched in straw. Keeps the weeds down. That means less work. I have to water a lot less. That saves me money. And because the soil stays moist and cool, the plants grow better. That mulch slowly decomposes and builds better soil. I think the added cost of buying that straw is certainly worth it. Another technique you should think about is growing vertical. In today's small gardens, space is at a premium, and the vegetables grow best in a sunny location. Now, I know there's YouTube videos that will give you the 10 vegetables that will grow in shade, and sure, they'll grow there and you'll get some produce, but they won't do well there. Almost all the vegetables want full sun. By midsummer, there's some that like a little shade just to get cool, but they all do best in full sun, and you have limited amount of full sun in most backyards. So grow vertical. Takes a small amount of soil. You can grow a lot of food. Pole beans, climbing peas, cherry tomatoes. Many of those are vines that will grow up to 8-10 feet. Cucumbers are usually grown on the ground and they take up a huge amount of space. I grow mine vertically, take almost no space. So think vertical. Think about that as soon as you start designing your garden, and think how you're going to go up. The last suggestion I have for you is to use cover crops. Now, as home gardeners, we don't use a lot of cover crops, and they've never been promoted that much. But the new science about building soil tells us that you want something growing on your soil all the time. As soon as your crop is finished, it should be replaced with something else. Even in cold climates that works. You're going to find plants that will grow in the fall when it's cool, or very early spring when it's too cool to plant your tomatoes. Try to have something growing on your soil all year long. The roots of those plants are adding organic matter to the soil, which is feeding the microbes, which increases the microbe population, which improves your soil. It's really a simple formula. We have to get that organic matter in there, and roots of plants is one of the best ways to do that. I hope you got a few suggestions out of this video to help you cut down the cost of growing vegetables. Try to save some money and cut some corners, but don't be too focused on the cost. The other benefits of a vegetable garden far outweigh the money you're going to save. Now that you know how to save a bit of money, time to learn how to grow vegetables. And I have a couple choices for you. Over here is a list of 13 videos. That is my vegetable growing course for new beginners. Teach you everything you need to know, starting from seed, doing transplants, what to buy, which ones to choose, how do you select seeds, everything you need to know. And over here is my video about the 10 best vegetables for new gardeners. Happy vegetable growing.